The morning routine at the brownstone on West 35th Street was as predictable as sunrise and twice as sacred. At 8:15, Fritz Brenner would appear in the office doorway with the coffee service, his round face bearing that expression of quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've just brewed perfection. At 8:30, Wolfe would descend from the plant rooms, settle his seventh of a ton into the custom-built chair behind his desk, and proceed to demolish whatever culinary masterpiece Fritz had prepared for breakfast. By 9 o'clock, the world was permitted to intrude, but only if it brought money, genuine intellectual challenge, or news that someone had insulted his orchids. This particular Thursday morning in October, the world chose to intrude at 8:47, which was either remarkably poor timing or remarkably good luck, depending on your perspective. I was at my desk, pretending to organize Wolfe's correspondence while actually reading the box scores, when the doorbell rang with the kind of insistence that suggested someone's world was ending and they expected us to care about it. Wolfe didn't look up from his shirred eggs with herbs. He never looked up when the doorbell rang during breakfast. It was my job to make the world go away until he was ready for it, and his job to pretend the world didn't exist until I failed. I walked to the front door and peered through the one-way glass. Standing on the stoop was a woman in her 40s with the kind of posture that suggested she was accustomed to being taken seriously by people who mattered. She wore a charcoal wool coat that whispered money without shouting it, and her dark hair was pulled back in a way that said she had more important things to think about than whether it was fashionable. Her face was pale, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if she expected to be followed. I opened the door. "Yes? Mr. Goodwin? I'm Vivian Marsh. I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately. It's about my husband." The name registered immediately. Julian Marsh was the food critic for the Times, a man whose weekly reviews could turn unknown bistros into reservation impossibilities or reduce celebrated chefs to tears. More relevantly, he was one of the few food writers whose opinion Wolfe actually respected, which put him in roughly the same category as unicorns and honest politicians. "Mr. Wolfe is at breakfast," I told her. "He doesn't see clients until—" "Someone tried to poison my husband last night," she interrupted, her voice steady but tight. "And now he's missing." I studied her face. She wasn't hysterical, wasn't wringing her hands, wasn't doing any of the things people usually do when they're lying about attempted murder. She stated it like she might announce that it looked like rain, which made it either completely fabricated or deadly serious. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "You can wait in the office while I see if Mr. Wolfe can spare a few minutes." I led her to the red leather chair that faced Wolfe's desk and offered coffee, which she accepted with the grateful look of someone who hadn't slept much. Then I returned to the dining room, where Wolfe was methodically working his way through what appeared to be a perfectly executed eggs Benedict. "There's a woman here named Vivian Marsh," I said without preamble. "She says someone tried to poison her husband last night and now he's disappeared." That got his attention. Wolfe set down his fork and looked at me with the expression he reserved for people who had just told him something genuinely interesting. "Mrs. Marsh, Julian Marsh's wife. She manages the business side of his career. Contracts, speaking engagements, that sort of thing. What evidence does she offer for this dramatic claim?" I didn't ask for details. I figured you'd want to hear them yourself, considering your opinion of her husband's palate. Wolfe had once described Julian Marsh as one of the few food critics in this city who understands that taste is both sensory experience and moral judgment, which from Wolfe was roughly equivalent to a papal blessing. He glanced at the clock on the wall, sighed deeply, and pushed back from the table. "Very well. Tell Fritz I may be late for lunch." When we entered the office, Vivian Marsh was sitting exactly as I'd left her, hands folded around her coffee cup, back straight, looking like she was prepared to wait as long as necessary, but hoping she wouldn't have to. Wolfe settled into his chair with the deliberate care of a man who knows that once he sits down, he's not getting up again until the problem is solved or dismissed. Mrs. Marsh, he said, his voice carrying that tone of polite attention he used when he was genuinely curious. Archie tells me you believe someone attempted to poison your husband. Pray continue. She set down her coffee cup with steady hands. Last night, Julian was the guest critic at the annual Culinary Excellence Awards dinner at the Plaza. It's a prestigious event. 200 of the city's most important restaurateurs, food writers, and chefs. Julian was seated at the head table next to the evening's honoré, Chef Antoine Dubois. I know of Chef Dubois, Wolfe murmured. His restaurant in Lyon earned 3 Michelin stars before he came to New York. A serious man with serious skills. The dinner was a 7-course tasting menu with each course prepared by a different celebrated chef. Julian's job was to sample each dish and offer brief comments to the audience. Everything went perfectly through the first 5 courses. Then came the 6th, a pan-seared sea base with saffron beurre blanc, prepared by Chef Marcus Kellerman from Le Bernardin. She paused, and for the first time her composure cracked slightly. Julian took one bite, and his face went white. He stood up abruptly, excused himself, and walked out of the dining room. Just like that, no explanation, no apology to the audience or to Chef Kellerman. He simply left. "And this constitutes attempted poisoning?" Wolfe asked, though his tone suggested he was prepared to be convinced. I followed him out to the lobby. Julian was leaning against a pillar, looking like he was going to be sick. He told me the fish tasted wrong, not spoiled, not undercooked, but deliberately corrupted. He said someone had added something bitter and metallic to the sauce, something that coated his tongue and made his throat burn. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Did anyone else taste the dish? That's just it. By the time Julian walked out, the entire dining room was in chaos. The servers were so flustered that they cleared all the plates before anyone else could try the fish. Chef Kellerman was mortified, of course. He insisted his dish was perfect when it left the kitchen. "And your husband? Where is he now?" Vivian Marsh's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "That's the problem, Mr. Wolfe. Julian never came home last night. He said he needed to think, needed to figure out who would do such a thing and why. He told me he was going to his office to review his notes from recent restaurant visits, see if he could identify who might have a grudge against him. That was at 11 o'clock. I haven't heard from him since. Have you contacted the police?" Julian has been missing for less than 12 hours. The police won't take it seriously until it's been 24. Besides, Julian specifically told me that if anything happened to him, I should come to you first. He said you were the only person in the city who would understand both the food and the malice. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, his eyes half closed in the way that meant he was either thinking deeply or falling asleep. Finally, he spoke. "Mrs. Marsh, your husband's public humiliation at a prestigious event could have been caused by any number of factors. A kitchen accident, a disgruntled employee, even simple incompetence. Why do you assume deliberate malice?" She reached into her purse and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Because of this. It was slipped under our apartment door sometime after midnight. I took the paper and read it aloud. Your husband's taste for trouble has finally caught up with him. If you want to see him again, convince him to develop a more accommodating palate. This is your only warning." Wolfe frowned and gestured for me to hand him the note. He examined it briefly. Computer printer, standard copy paper, block letters designed to disguise the writer's natural hand. "Crude but effective," he murmured. "The phrasing suggests someone with pretensions to literary style but limited imagination. Nevertheless, the threat appears genuine. Will you take the case, Mr. Wolfe?" Wolfe set the note on his desk and looked at Vivian Marsh with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Find my husband before whoever sent that note decides he's more trouble than he's worth. My fee is $50 a day plus expenses. You'll provide a retainer of $500 and complete access to your husband's office, appointment calendar, and recent correspondence. You'll also furnish me with a list of every restaurant he's reviewed negatively in the past 6 months and the names of any chefs, restaurateurs, or food industry figures who have expressed displeasure with his work. That's acceptable. Very well. Wolfe glanced at the clock. Archie will drive you to your husband's office and conduct a preliminary examination. I want to know what he was working on, whom he'd been planning to see, and whether anything appears to have been disturbed or removed. After Mrs. Marsh left, I turned to Wolfe with the question that had been nagging at me since she'd started talking. So what's your real reason for taking this case? It's not the money, and somehow I doubt its overwhelming concern for Julian Marsh's welfare. Wolfe picked up the threatening note and read it again. Someone has attempted to weaponize food, Archie. They have taken one of civilization's greatest pleasures and turned it into an instrument of intimidation. This suggests a mind that understands both the sensual and psychological power of taste and is willing to corrupt both for personal gain. He set the note down and looked at me with an expression that was part annoyance, part anticipation. Also, if Mr. Marsh has indeed been targeted because of his professional integrity, then every honest food critic in the city is potentially at risk. Since I depend on honest food critics to help me navigate this city's restaurants, I have a vested interest in ensuring their continued existence. That was Wolfe for you. Save a man's life, expose a criminal conspiracy, uphold the integrity of food criticism. But what really motivated him was protecting his own dining experiences. I was reaching for my coat when the phone rang. I picked it up on the second ring. Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking. Mr. Goodwin. The voice was male, nervous, and trying to sound more menacing than it actually was. You're working for Vivian Marsh, aren't you? Who wants to know? Someone who knows what happened to Julian Marsh. If you want him to keep breathing, stop looking for him. Some critics bite off more than they can chew. The line went dead. I hung up and looked at Wolfe, who had been listening to my end of the conversation with interest. Well, I said, looks like we've rattled someone's cage already. Should I be flattered or worried? Both, said Wolfe. And now we know we're dealing with people who are monitoring Mrs. Marsh's movements closely enough to know she came here. That suggests either professional surveillance or someone with access to inside information. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Archie, when you examine Mr. Marsh's office, pay particular attention to his recent restaurant reviews. I suspect we'll find that someone has taken his criticism very personally indeed. And if whoever has him decides he's too much trouble to keep alive. Wolfe opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression that was part determination, part hunger, the look he got when he encountered a problem that was both intellectually challenging and personally offensive. Then, he said quietly, they will discover that there are some appetites that should never be satisfied, and some tables from which one should never flee. I got my coat and headed for the door, wondering if Julian Marsh was still alive to appreciate the irony that his disappearance had finally given Nero Wolfe a case he could really sink his teeth into. The drive to Julian Marsh's office gave me 20 minutes to study Vivian Marsh without appearing to do so, which is one of the essential skills in the detecting business. She sat with her hands folded around a leather portfolio that looked like it had cost more than my monthly salary, answering my conversational probes with the kind of precision that suggested she'd been managing difficult questions for years. Julian keeps 2 offices, she explained as we navigated the morning traffic. One at home for his personal projects and correspondence, and the professional office on West 78th for meetings, interviews, and his formal files. He says proximity is the enemy of professional detachment. Smart man. Any recent threats besides angry letters and expensive wine? 3 lawsuit threats in the past 6 months, 2 routed through lawyers, 1 actual filing that was dismissed. The filing came from a restaurateur named Paolo Vescari, who owns La Porciuncola. Julian called his truffle supply olfactory confetti, and suggested it came from a craft store rather than the forests of Perigord. That would sting. Paolo wept on television. Then his reservation requests doubled for 2 weeks after people came to see what the fuss was about. He switched to real truffles, added authentic French truffles to his menu, and called to thank Julian. Then he called again to complain when Julian refused to retract the original review. Principle versus profit. Exactly. Julian said you don't retract principle to help someone's publicity. The office building was one of those converted warehouses that food writers and art critics favor when they want to appear serious about their craft without actually suffering for it. The elevator was old enough to have character and slow enough to test patience, but the hallway at the top was all polished hardwood and exposed brick with enough natural light to make you forget you were in Manhattan. Marsh's suite occupied the corner, with a small reception area and an inner office behind glass walls. The reception desk was empty, which Vivian explained by saying that Eden Clary, Julian's assistant, was visiting her mother in California and wouldn't return until next week. Convenient timing, I observed. Or planned timing. Julian specifically told Eden to take the week off. He said he wanted to work on his annual roundup without interruptions. The inner office was pure Julian Marsh. 3 walls lined with cookbooks in multiple languages, food magazines dating back decades, and every restaurant guide ever published for New York City. The 4th wall displayed framed reviews, awards, and photographs of Marsh with various celebrity chefs, most wearing the careful smiles people give to critics who hold their reputations in their hands. But it was the glass-fronted cabinet against the far wall that caught my attention immediately. It contained a row of silver tasting spoons arranged like soldiers on parade, each in its designated slot. There were 9 slots total. 8 contained gleaming spoons. The 9th was empty, with a dust outline that showed something had been there until recently. "Is this normal?" I asked, nodding toward the cabinet. Vivian followed my gaze and frowned. "Julian keeps identical sets at home and here. He's very particular about his spoons. Says different metals and shapes affect taste perception. He cleans and arranges them himself." "When did you last see this set complete?" "I don't pay attention to the spoons specifically, but Julian was here Tuesday afternoon for a meeting with his publisher. Everything seemed normal then." I examined the cabinet more closely. The missing spoon had left a perfect outline in the dust, suggesting it had been in place for months before being removed recently. Either Julian had taken it with him, or someone else had borrowed it for purposes unknown. The desk yielded more interesting information. A legal pad lay open with notes from the Plaza dinner. Course 6, Kellerman, sea bass, metallic, bitter, deliberate. Below that, a small square drawn in the margin with the letter L inside it. "L for what?" I asked Vivian. "Could be anything. Lemon, lye, location. Julian draws those little boxes when he's thinking hard about something. The letter usually represents whatever's bothering him most." The computer was password protected, but Julian's day planner was open beside it. The previous evening showed Plaza, 6 p.m., with a line drawn to midnight marked off. Today's page was blank except for a 3 p.m. entry, Kellerman follow-up, if necessary. The question mark had been underlined twice. I flipped back through recent pages, noting appointments with various restaurant owners and food industry figures. 3 names appeared frequently. Marcus Kellerman, the chef whose dish had allegedly been tampered with. Antoine Dubois, the honored guest who'd sat beside Julian at the dinner. And Lila Sand, identified in the margin as publicist major accounts. "Tell me about Lila Sand," I said. "She's a food industry publicist who represents about half the high-end restaurants in the city. She makes careers and breaks them, often in the same conversation. She and Julian have a complicated relationship. She needs his reviews. To be favorable, he needs her access to stay relevant. It's a dance they've been doing for years." "Professional or personal?" "Strictly professional, as far as I know. Lila offers access and suggests contextual sensitivity in exchange. Julian listens because he needs the information and declines because he values his integrity. She keeps trying because that's what publicists do. I continued searching the desk drawers. The bottom one was locked, which immediately made it the most interesting thing in the room. A few minutes with a paperclip and some creative persuasion convinced it to open, revealing a collection of manila folders that weren't restaurant reviews. These were investigations. Julian Marsh had apparently been conducting private inquiries into several establishments, documenting health code violations, tax irregularities, and what appeared to be systematic fraud. The thickest folder was labeled Quality Control Issues and contained correspondence with disgruntled kitchen staff, health inspectors, and suppliers. One letter, dated 2 weeks ago, was particularly revealing. It was from a former sous chef at Le Bernardin, who claimed that Marcus Kellerman had been substituting inferior ingredients in certain dishes while maintaining premium prices. The letter specifically mentioned metallic-tasting finishing oils and off-brand saffron that leaves a bitter aftertaste. "Did you know Julian was working on this?" I asked, showing Vivian the contents. Her eyes widened as she scanned the documents. "Number Julian never discussed his investigative work with me. He said it was safer if I didn't know the details until he was ready to publish." Before I could examine the other folders, the phone rang. I picked it up on the second ring. Julian Marsh's office. "You found the files?" The voice was male, nervous, and trying to sound more threatening than it actually was. It was the same voice that had called Wolfe's office earlier. "That was a mistake. Where is Julian Marsh?" "Safe, as long as you stop digging into things that don't concern you. Some critics bite off more than they can chew. This is your only warning." The line went dead, but this time I was ready for it. Someone was definitely monitoring our movements, and they were getting nervous about what we might discover. I gathered the relevant files and Julian's annotated materials, making sure to photograph the empty spoon slot and its dust outline. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something else, a small crescent-shaped depression in the carpet near the desk chair, the kind made when someone pivots quickly and then stops, as if they'd started to leave and then decided against it. "We're taking these files back to Mr. Wolfe," I told Vivian as we waited for the elevator. "And I have a feeling your husband's disappearance is about more than hurt feelings over a bad review. What do you think it's really about?" I thought about the missing spoon, the investigative files, and the nervous voice on the phone. I think Julian discovered something that certain people would prefer remained undiscovered. And I think they've decided he's more dangerous as a critic than he would be as a victim. The elevator arrived with its usual mechanical complaints, and as we descended toward street level, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Someone had made Julian Marsh disappear, and now they were keeping close tabs on anyone trying to find him. That suggested either professional surveillance or access to inside information, both of which pointed to people with resources and connections in the food industry. By the time we reached the street, I was already planning my report to Wolfe. A missing spoon, tampered food, investigative files, and a threatening phone call. All the ingredients for the kind of case that would keep Wolfe interested and me busy. The only question was whether we'd find Julian Marsh in time to ask him what he'd discovered that was worth kidnapping him for. The morning traffic had thickened while we'd been upstairs, and as I maneuvered through the gridlock toward the brownstone, I noticed a gray sedan with a dented rear fender that seemed to be taking the same route we were. It stayed 3 cars back, changed lanes when we did, and maintained the kind of professional distance that suggested its driver had done this before. "Mrs. Marsh," I said casually, "when we get to Mr. Wolfe's office, don't look back at the street. We appear to have acquired an audience." To her credit, she didn't turn around. "Should I be worried?" "Not yet, but it confirms that someone is taking your husband's disappearance very seriously indeed. The question is whether they're trying to protect him or silence him permanently." The drive back to the brownstone gave me 20 minutes to think about missing spoons, threatening phone calls, and the kind of people who consider food criticism a contact sport. By the time I parked in Wolfe's garage, I had 3 theories about Julian Marsh's disappearance, 2 of which involved a professional jealousy, and 1 of which involved something considerably more sinister. Wolfe was in the office, having finished his breakfast and moved on to the morning mail, which he was sorting with the methodical precision of a man who believes that correspondence, like cuisine, should be approached systematically. He glanced up when I entered with Mrs. Marsh, noted the manila folders under my arm, and gestured toward his desk. "Report," he said, which in Wolfe's vocabulary counts as both greeting and instruction. I spread Julian's files across his desk and gave him the complete inventory. The missing spoon with its telltale dust outline, the legal pad with its cryptic L notation, the locked drawer's treasure trove of investigative materials, and the letter from the former sous chef detailing Marcus Kellerman's alleged corner cutting. Mrs. Marsh listened with the expression of someone discovering that her husband had been leading a double life as a food industry detective. The most interesting discovery, I concluded, was this letter from a former Le Bernardin sous chef. He claims Kellerman has been substituting inferior ingredients and specifically mentions metallic-tasting finishing oils and off-brand saffron that leaves a bitter aftertaste. Wolfe examined the letter with the attention he usually reserved for rare orchid catalogues. "The correlation is compelling," he murmured. "Mr. Marsh was investigating Chef Kellerman for systematic fraud, and the symptoms he experienced at the Plaza dinner match precisely the adulterants described here." "There's more," I said, and told him about the threatening phone calls and the grey sedan that had followed us back from Julian's office. Wolfe's expression shifted from interest to something approaching annoyance, which in his case usually meant someone had violated the sanctity of his routine. Professional surveillance suggests organized opposition. They are monitoring Mrs. Marsh's movements and our involvement. This indicates either significant financial stakes or criminal liability. Before Mrs. Marsh could respond, the phone rang. I answered with my usual professional charm. "Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking." "Mr. Goodwin, I need to speak with Eden Clary immediately. This is regarding Julian Marsh." The voice was female, crisp and accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Clary isn't available. Who's calling?" "This is Lila Sand. I represent several establishments that Mr. Marsh has been investigating. I understand he's missing, and I'd like to offer my assistance in locating him." I covered the mouthpiece and looked at Wolfe, who nodded slightly. "Miss Sand, would you prefer to discuss this over the phone or in person?" "In person. I can be there in 20 minutes. After I hung up, Mrs. Marsh spoke for the first time since we'd returned. "Lila Sand is one of the most powerful publicists in the food industry. She represents Marcus Kellerman, among others. If she's offering to help, it's because she's worried about what Julian might publish." "Or," said Wolfe, "because she knows more about his disappearance than she's prepared to admit over the telephone." While we waited for Miss Sand's arrival, I called Eden Clary in Sacramento. It took several attempts and a conversation with the hospital receptionist, but I finally reached Julian's assistant at her mother's bedside. "Mr. Marsh is missing?" Her voice carried genuine shock mixed with something that might have been fear. I was afraid something like this might happen. "Why?" I asked, putting the call on speaker so Wolfe could listen. "For the past month, Mr. Marsh has been acting differently, more secretive, more paranoid." He started locking his desk drawer, something he'd never done before. He began asking odd questions about my schedule, who I'd been talking to, whether I'd noticed anyone watching the building. "Did he mention specific concerns about any restaurants or individuals?" "Not directly, but I know he'd been investigating ingredient suppliers and kitchen practices at several high-end establishments. He had me compile lists of restaurants that use the same food service companies. He was particularly interested in places that claimed to use premium ingredients but had suspiciously low food costs. Wolfe leaned forward. Miss Clary, did Mr. Marsh ever discuss his relationship with Lila Sand or express concerns about her influence in the industry? Ms. Sand calls frequently, trying to arrange access to new restaurants or schedule meetings with her clients. Mr. Marsh always took her calls, but lately he'd become more cautious about what he told her. Last week she called asking about his schedule for this week, and he specifically told me to tell her he was unavailable. After I hung up, Wolfe sat quietly for several minutes, his fingers steepled in front of his face. "The pattern is clear," he finally said. Mr. Marsh was conducting a systematic investigation into food industry fraud, focusing on ingredient substitution and false advertising. His work threatened significant financial interests, and someone decided to silence him rather than risk exposure. The doorbell rang precisely 20 minutes after Lila Sand's call, which suggested either punctuality or surveillance. Fritz admitted a woman in her 30s with sleek black hair, a charcoal suit that whispered expensive, and the kind of confident stride that comes from years of managing other people's crises. She carried a leather briefcase and wore the practiced smile of someone who negotiates for a living. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, settling into the red leather chair without invitation, "I'm Lila Sand. I believe we have a mutual interest in resolving this situation quickly and quietly." Wolfe studied her with the expression he reserved for specimens of uncertain classification. "Miss Sand, your interest in Mr. Marsh's welfare is touching. What precisely are you offering?" "Cooperation and information. I represent several of the establishments Mr. Marsh has been investigating, including Marcus Kellerman's restaurant. I know about his files, his sources, and his planned exposé. I also know that certain people in the industry are concerned about the potential damage to their reputations." "Concerned enough to kidnap a food critic?" Her smile flickered for just a moment. "Concerned enough to want to discuss the matter with him privately before he publishes allegations that could destroy careers and businesses based on incomplete information." "Where is Julian Marsh?" "I don't know, but I know who might, and I know what it would take to ensure his safe return." Wolfe's eyes narrowed slightly. "Enlighten me." "Mr. Marsh has been investigating a network of suppliers and restaurants involved in what he believes is systematic fraud. The reality is more complex. Yes, some establishments have been using less expensive ingredients than advertised, but they've been doing so to survive in an increasingly competitive market while maintaining quality standards that satisfy their customers. And the health code violations, the tax irregularities, misunderstandings and paperwork errors, mostly. The food industry is heavily regulated, Mr. Wolfe. Sometimes compliance falls behind best intentions. I watched Mrs. Marsh during this exchange. Her hands were clenched in her lap, and her jaw was tight with the kind of controlled anger that comes from hearing someone rationalize her husband's principles away. Before Wolfe could respond, the phone rang again. I answered, and this time the voice was different, older, more cultured, and infinitely more menacing. "Mr. Wolfe, I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I have Mrs. Marsh, if that's what you mean. But she belongs to herself and her husband." "I'm referring to certain files that were removed from Mr. Marsh's office this morning. Those files contain proprietary information that could be misinterpreted by people who don't understand the complexities of food service logistics." "Where is Julian Marsh?" "Mr. Marsh is reconsidering his approach to food criticism. He's discovered that there are perspectives on the industry that he hadn't previously considered. When he's finished with his reconsideration, I'm sure he'll have a much more nuanced understanding of how restaurants actually operate." The line went dead, and I looked at Lila Sand, who had gone very pale during the conversation. "That wasn't one of your clients, was it?" I asked. "No," she said quietly. "That sounded like Leon Kastner. He owns Metropolitan Food Services, one of the largest suppliers in the city. If he has Mr. Marsh ... She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The implication was clear enough. Wolfe turned to Mrs. Marsh. Your husband is alive, but his situation has become considerably more precarious. We are no longer dealing with wounded pride or professional rivalry. We are dealing with organized criminal activity on a significant scale. What do we do now? Now, said Wolfe, we discover exactly what your husband learned that was worth kidnapping him for. And then we use that information to bring him home. He looked at me with an expression that was part determination, part hunger, the look he got when he encountered a problem that was both intellectually challenging and personally offensive. Archie, call Saul Panzer. Tell him to locate Leon Kastner and Metropolitan Food Services. I want to know everything about their operations, their clients, and their financial situation. Also, have him investigate the connection between Kastner and the restaurants on Mr. Marsh's list. And Miss Sand. Miss Sand will provide us with a complete list of her clients and their suppliers. She will also arrange meetings with Marcus Kellerman and anyone else who might have information about Mr. Marsh's investigation. Lila Sand started to object, but Wolfe cut her off with a gesture. Miss Sand, you came here offering cooperation. I'm accepting your offer. You may cooperate voluntarily, or you may find yourself explaining to the police why you knew so much about a kidnapping before it was reported. The choice is yours. After she left, presumably to compile the requested information, I turned to Wolfe with the question that had been nagging at me. So what's your real assessment? Is Julian Marsh still alive? Wolfe picked up the threatening note from Julian's apartment and read it again. For now, yes. Mr. Kastner and his associates are businessmen, not killers. They took Mr. Marsh to silence him, not to eliminate him, but if they conclude that he cannot be persuaded to abandon his investigation— He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. We both understood that Julian Marsh's survival depended on finding him before his captors decided he was more trouble than he was worth. The phone rang again, and this time it was Saul Panzer with his first report. Archie, I've been watching the building like you asked. Your gray sedan left about an hour ago, but it's been replaced by a white panel van. Also, I ran some preliminary checks on Metropolitan Food Services. Interesting company. They supply about 60 restaurants in Manhattan, including most of the high-end establishments. Their profit margins are unusually high for a food service company. How high? High enough to suggest they're either very efficient or very creative with their pricing. I'll have more details by this evening. After I hung up, Wolfe sat quietly for several minutes, his eyes half closed in concentration. Finally, he spoke. The missing spoon troubles me, Archie. It's too specific to be coincidental, too symbolic to be practical. Someone took it for a reason. A trophy? Perhaps. Or a signature. Or ... He paused, his eyes opening suddenly. Or evidence. What if Mr. Marsh used one of his tasting spoons to sample the tampered dish at the plaza? What if he kept it as proof of the adulteration? That was a possibility I hadn't considered, but it made sense. Julian Marsh was methodical about his work, and if he suspected deliberate tampering, he might well have preserved evidence. So someone took the spoon to eliminate the evidence, or to analyze it themselves, to determine exactly what Mr. Marsh had discovered and how much he could prove. The afternoon was shaping up to be interesting in the Chinese curse sense of the word. We had a missing food critic, a network of potentially fraudulent suppliers, a powerful publicist with divided loyalties, and a spoon that might or might not contain the key to the entire mystery. I was reaching for my coat to begin the next phase of the investigation when Wolfe spoke again. Archie, when you interview Mr. Kellerman, pay particular attention to his relationship with Mr. Kastner. If Metropolitan Food Services is indeed involved in systematic fraud, the chefs who use their products are either victims or accomplices. Mr. Kellerman's reaction will tell us which. And if he's an accomplice? Then, said Wolfe quietly, we will have found at least one person who had both motive and opportunity to ensure that Mr. Marsh never publishes his investigation. I left the brownstone with a growing sense that Julian Marsh had stumbled onto something considerably larger than simple ingredient substitution. The question was whether we could unravel the conspiracy before his captors decided that a dead critic was safer than a silenced one. Marcus Kellerman's kitchen at Le Bernardin operated with the precision of a Swiss watch and the intensity of a war room. The afternoon prep was in full swing when I arrived. Knives flashing against cutting boards, flames leaping under sauté pans, and the kind of focused energy that comes from knowing that 200 covers depend on your ability to execute perfection under pressure. The maitre d' led me through the dining room, past tables where the lunch crowd was finishing their final courses, to a small office behind the kitchen where Kellerman was reviewing inventory sheets with the concentration of a man calculating his survival. He looked up when I entered. Mid-40s, compact build, with the kind of intense focus that successful chefs develop after years of orchestrating controlled chaos. His hands, I noticed, were immaculate despite having just come from the kitchen, and his chef's coat was spotless. Everything about him suggested a man who controlled his environment down to the smallest detail. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, rising to offer a handshake that was firm, but brief. "Lila Sand said you might be coming by. This business about Julian is terrible. Any word on where he might be?" "We're working on it. I'd like to ask you about what happened at the Plaza dinner, specifically about your sea bass with saffron beurre blanc." His expression shifted immediately from concern to something approaching defensiveness. "My dish was perfect when it left the kitchen. I personally supervised every aspect of its preparation. The notion that there was something wrong with it is—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Insulting. Julian Marsh said it tasted deliberately corrupted, bitter and metallic. Those are pretty specific complaints." "Julian Marsh was a drama queen," Kellerman said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it. "He had a flair for the theatrical. Perhaps he was having an off night, or perhaps he was under pressure to find fault." I settled into the chair across from his desk and pulled out my notebook. "Mr. Kellerman, we have information suggesting that Julian was investigating you for using inferior ingredients. Specifically, we have a letter from a former sous chef who claims you've been using off-brand saffron and finishing oils that leave a metallic taste." That hit home. His jaw tightened, and for just a moment, his composure cracked. "That disgruntled former employee couldn't poach an egg properly. His accusations are baseless." "Are they? Because the symptoms Julian experienced match exactly what this letter describes." Kellerman stood up abruptly and walked to a small refrigerator in the corner of his office. He withdrew a bottle of water, unscrewed the cap with hands that weren't quite steady, and took a long drink before turning back to me. "Mr. Goodwin, I've been cooking professionally for 25 years. My reputation is built on excellence and integrity. The suggestion that I would knowingly serve inferior ingredients is—" He trailed off, staring at the inventory sheets on his desk. "But you have had complaints about off flavors, haven't you?" He was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "Occasionally. Always the same description. Metallic, bitter, coating the tongue. It only happened with dishes that used certain ingredients from my primary supplier. Metropolitan Food Services." His eyes snapped up to meet mine. "How do you know about Metropolitan?" "Julian Marsh was investigating them. What can you tell me about Leon Kastner and his operation?" Kellerman returned to his chair, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he gripped the back of it with both hands. "Leon Kastner built Metropolitan from nothing. His prices are competitive, his delivery is reliable, and his product line includes specialty items that are hard to source elsewhere. When I complained about the occasional off flavors, he blamed seasonal variations or storage issues at my end. He always offered to replace anything I wasn't satisfied with. No questions asked." "And you accepted that explanation?" "What choice did I have? Metropolitan supplies half the high-end restaurants in the city. Their reputation is solid." Before I could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Kellerman's sous chef appeared, looking apologetic but urgent. "Chef, there's a gentleman here to see you. Says it's about your supplier contracts." Kellerman and I exchanged glances. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. "Show him to the bar," Kellerman said. "Tell him I'll be right there." After the sous chef left, I moved to the small window that looked out into the service alley. A white panel van was parked near the loading dock, the same type Saul had mentioned seeing outside the brownstone. "Mr. Kellerman, is there another way out of here? Through the kitchen to the front or up the back stairs to my apartment?" "Why?" "Because I think your visitor might be more interested in making sure you don't talk to me than in discussing supplier contracts." His face went pale. "You think they're watching me?" "I think they're watching everyone connected to Julian's investigation. Take the back stairs and stay upstairs until I call you. Don't answer your phone unless you recognize the number." "What about service tonight?" "Your staff can handle one evening without you. Your life is more important than your reputation." I waited until he disappeared up the back stairs, then made my way through the kitchen to the bar area. The gentleman waiting there was not someone I recognized, but he had the kind of professional bearing that suggested either law enforcement or expensive private security. He was examining the wine list with the attention of someone who was actually reading it rather than just passing time. "Mr. Kellerman had to step out," I told him. "Can I help you with something?" He looked up with pale blue eyes that catalogued everything they saw. "You must be Mr. Goodwin. I'm Thomas Wade, and I represent certain business interests that are concerned about recent developments in the food service industry." "What kind of developments?" "The kind that involve missing persons, stolen files, and journalists who don't understand the complexities of modern restaurant operations." "Where is Julian Marsh?" "Mr. Marsh is reconsidering his approach to food criticism. He's discovered that there are perspectives on the industry that he hadn't previously considered." The phrasing was almost identical to what I'd heard on the phone earlier, which suggested either a prepared script or a very limited imagination. "When will he be finished reconsidering?" "That depends on how quickly his friends and family accept that some stories are better left untold." Wade stood up and placed a business card on the table. "Mr. Goodwin, you seem like a reasonable man. Perhaps you could help Mrs. Marsh understand that her husband's investigation was based on incomplete information and misguided assumptions. The food service industry is more complex than most people realize. And if she doesn't see it that way, then Mr. Marsh's reconsideration period might be extended indefinitely." After Wade left, I called Saul from the restaurant phone. "Any progress on Metropolitan Food Services?" "You bet, Archie. Leon Kastner is running a shell game. On paper, Metropolitan imports high-end ingredients. In reality, they're buying cheap substitutes and rebranding them as premium. It's basically a massive counterfeiting operation, but with saffron instead of watches." "How massive?" "Millions of dollars. They're supplying about 60 restaurants in Manhattan, including most of the high-end establishments. The profit margins are astronomical because they're selling grocery store saffron at Kashmiri prices." "And the restaurants?" "Some are probably in on it, getting kickbacks or significant discounts. Others are victims who don't know they're being cheated. I found invoices showing that Le Bernardin has been getting twice the quantity they order for certain items, with the extra marked as promotional samples." That explained Kellerman's defensive behavior. He might not have been actively participating in the fraud, but he'd been benefiting from it and choosing not to ask too many questions. I made my way back to the brownstone through the early evening. Traffic, noting that the white panel van had been replaced by a grey sedan that maintained a professional distance behind me. Someone was definitely keeping tabs on my movements, which suggested that Julian Marsh had stumbled onto something worth serious money and serious risk. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair, a copy of the evening paper spread before him. He looked up as I entered, his eyes registering the folders I carried and the expression on my face. "Report," he said. I gave him the complete account, Kellerman's defensive behavior and gradual admission of quality problems, the mysterious visitor Thomas Wade and his veiled threats, Saul's findings about Metropolitan's counterfeiting operation, and the ongoing surveillance. So Julian wasn't just investigating a bad chef, I concluded. He was investigating a criminal enterprise that's been selling counterfeit gourmet ingredients to half the high-end restaurants in the city. The missing spoon probably contains evidence of the adulteration, and Leon Kastner's people took Julian to prevent him from publishing his exposé. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. The pattern is clear. Mr. Kastner has created a systematic fraud based on the average consumer's inability to distinguish between genuine and counterfeit luxury ingredients. The restaurants either participate knowingly for financial benefit or remain willfully ignorant to maintain their profit margins. And the accommodating palate mentioned in the threatening note. A demand for complicity. Mr. Marsh was expected to overlook the fraud in exchange for continued access to the industry. When he refused to accommodate, he became a liability. So what's our next move? Do we go to the police with Saul's findings? Wolfe shook his head. The police will move slowly and require irrefutable proof. Meanwhile, Mr. Marsh's situation becomes more precarious by the hour. We must force Mr. Kastner's hand. How? By making him understand that keeping Mr. Marsh silent has become more dangerous than releasing him. We will gather everyone with a stake in this deception and expose their vulnerabilities. Mr. Kastner believes he can control the narrative through intimidation. We will prove him wrong. The phone rang, and I answered with my usual professional charm. Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking. Mr. Goodwin, this is Leon Kastner. I believe it's time we had a conversation. I covered the mouthpiece and looked at Wolfe, who nodded. Mr. Kastner, we've been hoping to hear from you. When would you like to meet? Tonight, 9 o'clock. My facility in Long Island City. Come alone and bring the files you took from Mr. Marsh's office. And Julian Marsh. Will be returned to his wife once we've reached an understanding about the proper role of food criticism in a complex industry. After I hung up, Wolfe sat quietly for several minutes, his eyes half closed in concentration. Archie, call Mrs. Marsh and tell her to expect her husband home by midnight. Then call Inspector Kramer and inform him that we will have information about a kidnapping and a major fraud case within the next few hours. You want me to go to that meeting? Number, we want Mr. Kastner to come here. Call him back and tell him that if he wants the files, he can collect them from my office. If he refuses, tell him that the files will be delivered to the district attorney's office first thing tomorrow morning. And if he calls our bluff, then we will discover whether Mr. Kastner is a businessman or a killer. But I suspect he is too intelligent to choose the latter course when the former is still available to him. I made the calls, and within an hour, Leon Kastner had agreed to come to the brownstone at 10 o'clock, accompanied by no more than 2 associates. He would bring Julian Marsh with him, and we would discuss terms for the return of the files and the end of the investigation. One more thing, Archie, Wolfe said as I prepared to call Saul with instructions for surveillance. When Mr. Kastner arrives, pay particular attention to his hands. If he's been handling adulterated spices and oils, there may be residual stains or odors that confirm his direct involvement in the counterfeiting operation. And if there are, then we will have all the evidence we need to ensure that Mr. Marsh's story gets published, with or without his cooperation. The evening was shaping up to be interesting in the most dangerous sense of the word. We had a kidnapped food critic, a criminal conspiracy worth millions of dollars, and a confrontation scheduled for Wolfe's office that would determine whether Julian Marsh lived to write another review. I was reaching for my coat to make one final reconnaissance of the neighborhood when the phone rang again. This time, it was a voice I didn't recognize. Female, nervous, and trying to sound more confident than she felt. Mr. Goodwin, this is Eden Clary. I'm calling from the airport. I'm flying back to New York tonight. There's something about Mr. Marsh's investigation that I didn't tell you before. Something that might help you find him." "What kind of something?" "Mr. Marsh kept a backup copy of all his investigative files in a safety deposit box. He gave me the key 2 weeks ago and told me that if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone who would know what to do with the information." "Where's the box?" "First National Bank on Columbus Circle. Box 247. Mr. Goodwin, there's something else. The day before I left for California, a man came to the office asking questions about Mr. Marsh's schedule. He said he was from Metropolitan Food Services, and he wanted to arrange a meeting to discuss Mr. Marsh's concerns about their products." "Did you give him the information?" "I told him Mr. Marsh was unavailable and suggested he call back after I returned from vacation, but I think he might have been watching the office. I saw the same man parked across the street when I left for the airport. After I hung up, I turned to Wolfe with a grin that probably looked more confident than I felt. Well, it looks like Julian Marsh was smarter than his kidnappers realized. He's got a backup copy of everything, and we're about to get our hands on it." "Excellent," said Wolfe. "Call Mr. Kastner and inform him that the terms of our meeting have changed. He will still bring Mr. Marsh, but now he will also explain why his employee was conducting surveillance on a journalist's office." The game was definitely escalating, and for the first time since this case began, I felt like we might be holding the winning hand. The safety deposit box at First National Bank contained Julian Marsh's insurance policy against exactly the kind of people who make food critics disappear. Eden Clary met me there at 8 o'clock, looking like she'd spent the flight from California rehearsing bad news. She was a compact woman in her late 20s with intelligent eyes and the kind of nervous energy that comes from carrying secrets that could get people killed. "Mr. Marsh was obsessive about documentation," she explained as we waited for the bank officer. "He said that in investigative journalism, your files are your life insurance. If something happens to you, the evidence has to survive to tell the story." Box 247 yielded a treasure trove that would have made any prosecutor weep with joy. 3 manila folders contained photocopies of invoices, shipping records, and correspondence that painted a detailed picture of Metropolitan's counterfeiting operation. They were importing cheap spices and oils from questionable sources, repackaging them with premium labels, and selling them to restaurants at luxury prices. The profit margins were staggering. Grocery store saffron being sold at Kashmiri prices. Synthetic truffle oil masquerading as the genuine article. But the most valuable item was a small velvet pouch containing a silver tasting spoon identical to those in Julian's office collection. This one bore a faint, greenish-gray discoloration near the bowl, the residue from the plaza dinner that had sent Julian fleeing from the table. "He always carried sample spoons to formal tastings," Eden explained. "Said you never knew when you might encounter something worth preserving for analysis." The final item was a digital recorder with a piece of tape marked Kastner Meeting, October 15th. 2 weeks ago, Julian had met with Leon Kastner himself, and he'd recorded every word. I pocketed the recorder and examined the spoon more closely. The discoloration wasn't random. It formed a distinct pattern around the bowl's curve, suggesting whatever had caused it was deliberately applied rather than accidentally encountered. "Miss Clary, did Julian seem different after his meeting with Kastner?" "Frightened. He came back to the office pale and shaky, said Kastner had made it clear that Metropolitan had powerful friends and that journalists who caused problems sometimes found themselves with bigger problems than they could handle. The drive back to the brownstone gave me 20 minutes to think about missing spoons, recorded threats, and the kind of people who consider intimidation a legitimate business practice. The gray sedan maintained its professional distance, but I noticed it had been joined by a white panel van that seemed equally interested in my itinerary. Back at the brownstone, something felt wrong the moment I walked through the front door. Nothing obvious. Fritz was humming in the kitchen, the afternoon light filtered through the stained glass in familiar patterns, and Wolfe was presumably in his chair with his afternoon reading. But there was a quality to the silence, a sense of recent disturbance that raised the hair on my neck. I walked into the office. Wolfe looked up from what appeared to be a botanical journal, his eyes immediately cataloguing my expression and the attaché case under my arm. "Report," he said, which from Wolfe counts as both greeting and command. I spread Julian's evidence across his desk, the folders, the recorder, and finally the velvet pouch containing the spoon. Julian was thorough, lab reports confirming adulteration, financial records showing the profit margins, employee affidavits detailing the repackaging operation, and this, the spoon he used at the plaza, with residue still on it. Wolfe picked up the spoon delicately, examining the discoloration with a jeweler's loupe from his desk drawer. Metallic compound, certainly, combined with what appears to be a concentrated bittering agent. Deliberate adulteration, beyond question. There's more. Julian recorded his meeting with Kastner 2 weeks ago, 30 minutes of threats and attempted bribery. Before Wolfe could respond, Fritz appeared in the doorway with an expression I'd never seen on his face, a combination of confusion, indignation, and something approaching fear. "Mr. Wolfe," he said carefully, "I must report an irregularity in the kitchen." Wolfe's attention shifted immediately. Fritz didn't use words like irregularity unless something was seriously wrong. "Explain?" "This afternoon, a delivery man brought a gift basket from Metropolitan Food Services. He said it was a courtesy from Mr. Kastner, no obligation. I should not have accepted it, but he was very insistent, and I was distracted by the bread rising." Fritz led us to the kitchen, where a wicker hamper sat on the center table like an unwelcome guest. Inside were bottles of olive oil, packets of spices, and a vacuum-sealed container of saffron that had the bright, uniform appearance of something that had never met a crocus. "I brought it in and set it here," Fritz continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Then I went to check my spice cabinet, as I always do when new supplies arrive. The saffron jar. Someone had opened it." He held up a glass jar labeled saffron in his precise handwriting. The wax seal. Around the lid had been softened and reset, not perfectly, but adequately. Inside, the threads were bright as confetti and smelled like pennies left in a coffee can. "My saffron does not smell metallic," Fritz said with quiet fury. "Someone entered my kitchen and contaminated my supplies." Wolfe's face had gone very still, the way it did when someone had committed an offense so fundamental that he was having trouble choosing between rage and contempt. "They presumed to enter my house and corrupt my kitchen. This is no longer about journalism or commerce. This is personal." I examined the jar more closely. The substitution had been done carefully, but not perfectly. Whoever had done it understood cooking well enough to match the appearance, but lacked Fritz's meticulous attention to detail. The replacement saffron was the same bright yellow as the original, but it lacked the subtle variations in color and texture that marked genuine Kashmiri threads. "They timed it perfectly," I observed. Knew Fritz's routine, knew when he'd be distracted. This wasn't random, it was reconnaissance followed by execution. Indeed. And it confirms that Mr. Kastner's operation extends beyond simple counterfeiting. They are willing to violate private homes to make their point. I walked back to my desk to make notes and immediately noticed something wrong. My pen holder, a small porcelain bust of Napoleon that usually held a dozen pens, now held 11. A specific blue pen, a gift from a former client that I always kept in the front slot, was missing. "They were in the office too," I said. "Took one of my pens." Wolfe nodded grimly. "A calling card. They want us to know they can enter our sanctuary at will. A psychological maneuver designed to unnerve us before tonight's meeting." "Should I call Saul?" "No need. He's been watching the gray sedan for the past hour. The pen is merely theater. The message has been received." Wolfe leaned back, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something approaching personal anger in his expression. Mr. Kastner believes he can intimidate us by violating our home. He will discover his error. The evening passed with the kind of deliberate tension that comes before a storm. Fritz prepared dinner with extra care, as if perfect cuisine could somehow restore the violated sanctity of his kitchen. Wolfe ate with apparent calm, but I noticed he sampled each dish more carefully than usual, and he had Fritz bring the saffron from his private reserves rather than the contaminated jar. At 9:30, I disabled the alarm system and unlocked the front door. Saul emerged from the shadows like a professional ghost. 3 vehicles now, he reported quietly. The gray sedan, a white panel van, and a black Mercedes that arrived 10 minutes ago. 6 men total, all armed. Kastner's not taking any chances. Neither are we. Stay close, but stay hidden. If this goes wrong, we'll need witnesses. At precisely 10 o'clock, the black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Leon Kastner emerged from the back seat. A distinguished man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from years of making other people's problems disappear. 2 men followed him, both with the professional alertness of expensive security. Finally, from the other side of the car, came Julian Marsh. Julian looked tired and rumpled, his clothes wrinkled and his face pale from confinement, but his eyes still held their characteristic intelligence. When he saw me at the door, he managed a weak smile. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "I trust Mrs. Marsh as well. She's been worried about you. Mr. Wolfe is looking forward to your conversation." Kastner stepped forward with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to controlling conversations before they began. "Mr. Goodwin, I'm Leon Kastner. I believe we have a mutual interest in resolving this situation quietly and efficiently." I stepped aside to let them enter. Mr. Wolfe doesn't believe in quiet resolutions when loud ones serve justice better. In the office, Kastner settled into the red leather chair without invitation, his eyes taking in the orchid arrangements, the wall of books, and finally Wolfe himself, who hadn't bothered to look up from the papers on his desk. "Mr. Wolfe," Kastner said, extending a hand that Wolfe ignored. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Wolfe finally raised his eyes, and I recognized the expression on his face. The look he reserved for people who had just revealed themselves to be fundamentally contemptible. "Mr. Kastner," he said quietly, "I have evidence of kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. I also have a violated kitchen and a contaminated spice jar. You have entered my home uninvited and corrupted my supplies. This is no longer a matter of business. It is a matter of principle." Kastner's smooth facade flickered for just a moment. He hadn't expected the conversation to begin with accusations rather than negotiations. "Mr. Wolfe, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Marsh has been my guest while we discussed his concerns about certain business practices. No crime has been committed. Untrue on multiple counts. You have held a man against his will, threatened him with violence, and attempted to suppress legitimate journalism through intimidation. You have also violated the sanctity of my home and contaminated my kitchen. In most civilized jurisdictions, these activities are considered criminal." Julian Marsh, seeing familiar surroundings and hearing Wolfe's measured but implacable voice, straightened in his chair. "Mr. Wolfe, I have 30 minutes of recorded conversation with Mr. Kastner in which he makes his position quite clear. He views journalism as a subsidiary of his business empire, subject to his editorial control." "Indeed. And now, Mr. Kastner, you will explain why your employee was conducting surveillance on Mr. Marsh's office, why your products were substituted for mine in my own kitchen, and why you believe kidnapping is an acceptable response to unfavorable restaurant reviews." Kastner's confidence was beginning to crack, and I could see him reassessing the situation. He'd come here expecting to negotiate with a reclusive eccentric and his assistant. Instead, he was facing a man who had just declared war on his entire operation. "Mr. Wolfe," he said carefully, The food service industry is more complex than most people realize. Sometimes compromises are necessary to maintain competitive pricing while ensuring quality standards. You mean fraud is necessary to maintain profit margins while deceiving customers? I mean, business has its own realities. Journalists who understand those realities tend to have long, successful careers. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Mr. Kastner, you have made two fundamental errors. First, you assumed that corruption of food, the very foundation of civilized life, was merely a business decision rather than a moral crime. Second, you violated my home to make your point. Both errors will now be corrected. The confrontation was just beginning, but already I could see that Kastner had underestimated both Wolfe's principles and his capacity for righteous anger. The man who had built his fortune on counterfeit saffron and intimidated journalists was about to discover that some appetites, including the appetite for justice, could not be satisfied with substitutes. Léon Kastner settled into the red leather chair with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to controlling conversations before they began. His silver cufflinks caught the lamplight as he arranged his sleeves, each one engraved with a small boxed L that would have meant nothing to most observers. Unfortunately for Mr. Kastner, most observers hadn't spent the morning examining Julian Marsh's investigative files. "Mr. Wolfe," Kastner said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of expensive education and successful intimidation, "I believe we have a mutual interest in resolving this situation quietly and efficiently." Wolfe didn't look up from the papers on his desk. When he finally raised his eyes, his expression held the particular distaste he reserved for people who had just revealed themselves to be fundamentally contemptible. "Mr. Kastner," he said quietly, "you have entered my home uninvited, corrupted my kitchen supplies, and held a respected journalist against his will. This is no longer a matter of business. It is a matter of principle. I think there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," I interrupted, "is your assumption that we're as gullible as your restaurant clients." I reached for Julian's legal pad and slid it across the desk so that his sketched symbol, a small L, enclosed in a square, sat directly between Wolfe and Kastner. "Lyonesse Agro, your Hamburg shell company. Julian drew this after seeing it stamped on crates at your warehouse." Kastner's eyes flicked to his cufflinks, then back to the sketch. For the first time since entering the office, his composure showed a hairline crack. "Before we continue," Wolfe said, reaching into his desk drawer, "perhaps we should review your previous conversation with Mr. Marsh." He withdrew the digital recorder Julian had hidden in the safety deposit box and placed it on the desk with the deliberate precision of a chess master positioning his queen for checkmate. "I don't know what you think you have there," Kastner began, but Wolfe was already pressing play. The office filled with Kastner's recorded voice, smooth and urbane as he detailed the benefits of cooperation and the unfortunate consequences of stubbornness. "Mr. Marsh, you seem to misunderstand the nature of food criticism in this city. Critics who work with us find their careers flourishing. Those who work against us find their access limited." Julian's voice responded with admirable steadiness. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Kastner?" "I'm offering you perspective. Journalists who understand the bigger picture tend to write more balanced reviews. Those who focus on minor technical issues sometimes find themselves writing about minor restaurants for minor publications." Wolfe stopped the recording and examined Kastner with the attention he usually reserved for specimens of uncertain classification. 37 minutes of threats and attempted bribery, Mr. Kastner. Shall we continue, or have you heard enough to refresh your memory?" Kastner's two associates shifted uncomfortably by the door. They'd been prepared for physical confrontation, perhaps negotiation, but not this methodical intellectual dissection. "That recording was made without my consent," Kastner said, his voice tight with controlled desperation. "It's inadmissible in any legal proceeding." "Perhaps," Wolfe conceded, but it's perfectly admissible in the court of public opinion, particularly when accompanied by these. He gestured to the manila folders spread across his desk. Financial records showing your substitution of inferior ingredients for premium prices. Laboratory analyses confirming adulteration. Employee affidavits detailing your repackaging operations. I picked up the velvet pouch and removed Julian's tasting spoon, placing it where the lamplight caught the greenish-gray residue around the bowl. And this, the spoon Julian used at the plaza dinner, with traces of your metallic bittering agent still on it. Furthermore, Julian said, his voice gaining strength as he leaned forward in his chair, during my involuntary stay at your facility, I learned that the counterfeiting extends beyond simple ingredient substitution. Your saffron contains chemical dyes not approved for food use. Your truffle oil includes synthetic compounds that cause allergic reactions. Your olive oil has been cut with industrial lubricants. Kastner shot to his feet, his face flushed. That's absolutely false. Every product we supply meets FDA standards. Sit down, Wolfe said quietly, but with enough authority to make Kastner comply immediately. The big man's composure was cracking like cheap paint in sunlight. Fritz appeared in the doorway, his arms crossed, his round face set in an expression of controlled fury. In his hands was the contaminated saffron jar, its wax seal crudely reset. Someone, Fritz said with quiet precision, entered my kitchen and substituted this abomination for my carefully sourced saffron. My saffron does not smell of pennies and industrial chemicals. Wolfe's expression shifted to something approaching personal rage, a rare and dangerous thing. You presume to violate my home and corrupt my kitchen, Mr. Kastner. You have taken one of civilization's greatest pleasures and turned it into an instrument of intimidation. This is not merely fraud. It is an assault on the very foundations of civilized life. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock. Kastner's face had gone ashen as he finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. He'd come expecting to negotiate with a reclusive eccentric and his assistant. Instead, he faced a man who had just declared war on his entire operation. "What do you want?" Kastner whispered. "Justice," Wolfe replied implacably. "Full restitution to the restaurants you've defrauded. Immediate cessation of all counterfeiting activities. Complete cooperation with federal investigators, a detailed confession naming all accomplices, and a public apology to every food critic you've targeted or intimidated. And in exchange, Mr. Marsh will delay publication of his exposé for 48 hours, giving you time to contact your attorney and arrange surrender to the appropriate authorities. Your cooperation will be noted, which may influence your eventual sentence." Kastner looked around the room like a trapped animal. His empire of counterfeit saffron and intimidated critics was collapsing, and he finally understood that Nero Wolfe was not a man who could be bought, threatened, or reasoned with once his principles had been engaged. "I need time to consider." "You have until noon tomorrow," Wolfe cut him off. "After that, Mr. Marsh's story will be published with or without your cooperation. Inspector Kramer will receive copies of all evidence, and the district attorney will be provided with documentation of kidnapping, conspiracy, and criminal fraud." As Kastner and his men prepared to leave, Julian straightened in his chair with the relieved expression of a man who had just been pulled back from the edge of a cliff. "Mr. Wolfe," he said quietly, "I can't thank you enough. When they took me from the plaza, I thought my career was over, possibly my life. Your career is far from over, Mr. Marsh. An exposé of this magnitude will establish you as one of the most important investigative food journalists in the country." Wolfe picked up the contaminated saffron jar and examined it with distaste. "And Mr. Kastner will discover that there are some violations that demand not merely legal justice, but personal satisfaction." After the others left, I turned to Wolfe with a grin that probably looked more confident than I felt. "Think he'll cave?" "He will calculate," Wolfe said. "He will decide whether one day of grace is less costly than immediate exposure. He will also speculate whether I can deliver on my threats. His lips compressed in what might have been satisfaction. He will underestimate me by a margin sufficient to make tomorrow's gathering worthwhile. Tomorrow's gathering. Indeed. Call Mrs. Marsh, Miss Sand, Chef Kellerman, and anyone else implicated in Mr. Marsh's files. Tell them to be here at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Also call Inspector Kramer and inform him that we will have a kidnapping and major fraud case resolved by evening. I reached for my coat, but Wolfe's voice stopped me. Archie, when you make those calls, pay particular attention to their reactions. Fear, relief, anger. Each will tell us whether we're dealing with victims or accomplices. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed. And remove that contaminated jar to the safe. I will not have that abomination in Fritz's reach a moment longer. As I headed for the phone, I reflected that Leon Kastner had made two fundamental errors. First, he'd assumed that corruption of food was merely a business decision rather than a moral crime. Second, he'd violated Nero Wolfe's home to make his point. Both errors were about to be corrected, with interest. 4 o'clock at the Brownstone has its own particular gravity. Fritz had banished the contaminated metropolitan hamper to the cellar like a diseased thing. The afternoon light filtered through the office windows with the golden patience of justice deferred, and I had arranged enough chairs to accommodate what Wolfe called the final accounting. The red leather chair faced the desk like a dock awaiting its defendant, with the yellow chairs arranged in a careful semicircle that would allow Wolfe to observe every face, every gesture, every tell that might betray guilt or innocence. They arrived with the punctuality of people who understand that tardiness, under the circumstances, might be interpreted as guilt. Vivian Marsh entered first, her composure restored, but her eyes still holding the shadow of 36 hours spent wondering if her husband would return alive. Julian followed, clean-shaven and wearing a fresh suit, but with the pallor of a man who had spent too much time in rooms without windows. Marcus Kellerman came next, his chef's whites replaced by civilian clothes that made him look smaller, more vulnerable. His hands, I noticed, showed the fine tremor of a man whose career was balanced on the edge of revelation. Lila Sand arrived precisely on time, her professional armor intact, but her eyes betraying the calculation of someone, trying to determine which way the wind would blow. Thomas Wade entered with the wary alertness of a man who had discovered that his carefully constructed threats had backfired spectacularly. He positioned himself near the door with the instinctive positioning of someone who might need to leave quickly. Leon Kastner was the last to arrive, flanked by two associates whose presence suggested he still believed this was a negotiation rather than a reckoning. He settled into the red leather chair with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling conversations, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested his composure was more performance than reality. Wolfe surveyed the assembled group with the methodical attention he usually reserved for orchid catalogues. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the measured authority that made prosecutors weep with gratitude. "We are gathered to discuss the systematic corruption of this city's food industry, the kidnapping of a respected journalist, and the violation of my kitchen." He paused, allowing the weight of those accusations to settle over the room like dust from a collapsed building. "The sequence of events is clear. Mr. Marsh, in the course of his professional duties, discovered evidence of systematic fraud in the supply chain serving this city's finest restaurants. When he attempted to investigate further, he was first humiliated publicly, then abducted, and finally threatened with permanent silencing. The conspiracy involved not merely the counterfeiting of luxury ingredients, but the corruption of the very critics whose job it is to maintain standards of excellence. Wolfe reached for Julian's legal pad and displayed the sketched symbol, a small L enclosed in a square. "Mr. Marsh drew this after visiting your warehouse, Mr. Kastner. It represents the mark of Lioness Agro, your Hamburg shell company, through which you import inferior ingredients for repackaging as premium products." Kastner's eyes flicked involuntarily to his cufflinks, each bearing the same boxed L that had seemed merely decorative until this moment. That's circumstantial at best. Perhaps, Wolfe conceded, but when combined with these, he gestured to the manila folder spread across his desk. The circumstantial becomes conclusive. Financial records showing your substitution of grocery store saffron for Kashmiri threads. Laboratory analyses confirming the presence of industrial dyes and synthetic compounds in products labeled as natural. Employee affidavits detailing your repackaging operations. I picked up the velvet pouch and removed Julian's tasting spoon, placing it where the lamplight caught the greenish-gray residue around the bowl. And this, the spoon Mr. Marsh used at the plaza dinner, with traces of your metallic bittering agent still clinging to the silver. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock and Lila Sand's increasingly rapid breathing. She was calculating, I could see, weighing cooperation against defiance. Miss Sand, Wolfe continued, turning his attention to her with surgical precision, your role in this conspiracy was to serve as intermediary between Mr. Kastner's operation and the critics who might threaten it. You identified potential problems and offered solutions, sometimes in the form of access and favorable placement, sometimes in the form of more direct persuasion. Her professional smile flickered. I provide publicity services, Mr. Wolfe. That's hardly criminal. When those services include arranging the systematic intimidation of journalists, they become conspiracy to commit extortion. I withdrew a photocopied invoice from the files. Metropolitan Food Services, payment to Sand & Associates Public Relations, October 3rd. Services rendered, media consultation and critic management. Amount, $15,000. Before she could respond, Wolfe activated the digital recorder. The office filled with Kastner's smooth voice detailing his perspective on food criticism and the consequences for those who didn't understand the bigger picture. When the recording ended, Julian leaned forward with the focused intensity of a man hearing his own near-death experience dissected. Mr. Kastner made it clear that critics who worked with him prospered, while those who worked against him found their access limited and their careers damaged. Indeed, Wolfe said. And when Mr. Marsh proved unamenable to persuasion, more direct methods were employed. Chef Kellerman, would you care to explain your role in the Plaza incident? Kellerman had been studying his hands with the intensity of a man trying to memorize his own fingerprints. He looked up with the expression of a condemned man asked to confess his sins in public. I knew something was wrong with the dish before it was served, he said quietly. The sauce had that metallic taste, that bitter coating. But the servers were lined up, the audience was waiting, and I... He trailed off, his voice barely above a whisper. I hoped Mr. Marsh wouldn't notice. Instead, you hoped a respected food critic would overlook deliberate adulteration rather than embarrass you in public. I panicked. My reputation, my restaurant, everything depended on that dinner going perfectly. Metropolitan had been my supplier for 2 years. When there were occasional problems, Mr. Kastner always made them right. I thought this was just another batch variation, yet you served it anyway. I was a coward, Kellerman said simply. I chose my reputation over my integrity. Wolfe turned to Thomas Wade, who had been maintaining the alert stillness of a man trying to become invisible. Mr. Wade, your employer's operation required enforcement. You provided surveillance, intimidation, and when necessary, more direct intervention. The threatening phone calls, the break-in at Mr. Marsh's office, the violation of my kitchen, all coordinated through you. Wade's pale eyes remained steady. I provide security consulting. If that's criminal, half the businesses in this city are breaking the law. When that consulting involves kidnapping journalists and contaminating private residences, it becomes considerably more than a business service. Wolfe's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You entered my home, Mr. Wade. You corrupted my kitchen. You violated the sanctity of the place where I live and work. This is not merely criminal. It is personal. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Even Kastner shifted uncomfortably as he realized that his employee had committed an offense that transcended mere business rivalry. "The sequence is clear," Wolfe continued. "Mr. Marsh discovered evidence of your fraud. Miss Sand arranged a meeting, ostensibly to resolve his concerns. When he proved uncooperative, he was publicly humiliated at the plaza dinner, then abducted and held until he agreed to abandon his investigation. When Mrs. Marsh sought help, my office was monitored, my movements tracked, and my kitchen violated as a warning." Fritz appeared in the doorway, his round face set in an expression of controlled fury. In his hands was the contaminated saffron jar, its wax seal crudely reset. "This abomination," he said with quiet precision, "was substituted for my carefully sourced saffron. It smells of pennies and industrial chemicals. It is an insult to the very concept of cuisine." Wolfe's expression shifted to something approaching personal rage, a rare and dangerous thing. "You corrupted food, Mr. Kastner. You took one of civilization's greatest pleasures and turned it into an instrument of intimidation and fraud. You poisoned not merely ingredients, but the trust between chef and diner, between critic and reader, between supplier and restaurant." Before Kastner could respond, the doorbell rang with the authoritative insistence that could only mean Inspector Kramer. I went to admit him, noting his grim satisfaction as he surveyed the assembled group. "Wolfe said you had something for me," he grunted. "Something about kidnapping and fraud." "Indeed, Inspector. Mr. Kastner and his associates have been operating a criminal conspiracy involving counterfeit luxury foods, intimidation of journalists, and kidnapping. The evidence is comprehensive, and the confessions are about to begin." Kramer's eyes swept the room, cataloging faces and calculating charges. "Looks like I'm just in time for the main course." The dominoes fell with satisfying precision. Faced with federal charges and overwhelming evidence, Lila Sand agreed to provide complete records of her consultation work. Marcus Kellerman offered to testify about the pressure he'd received and the compromises he'd made. Thomas Wade, after a whispered conversation with his hastily summoned attorney, detailed the surveillance and intimidation operations he'd coordinated. Leon Kastner, his empire of counterfeit saffron crumbling around him, finally understood that his carefully constructed web of corruptions had trapped him as surely as it had ensnared his victims. As the various conspirators were led away to provide formal statements, Julian turned to Wolfe with the expression of a man who had been pulled back from the edge of professional and personal destruction. "Mr. Wolfe, I cannot adequately express my gratitude. When they took me from the plaza, I thought my career was over." "Your career is far from over, Mr. Marsh. An exposé of this magnitude will establish you as one of the most important investigative journalists in the country." Wolfe leaned back in his chair with evident satisfaction. "And Mr. Kastner has learned that there are some appetites, including the appetite for justice, that cannot be satisfied with substitutes." Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face beaming with the satisfaction of a man whose kitchen had been restored to its proper sanctity. "Dinner is served," he announced, "and I have prepared it with genuine saffron, imported directly from Kashmir and verified by personal taste." As we made our way to the dining room, I reflected that Leon Kastner had made two fundamental errors. First, he had assumed that corruption of food was merely a business decision rather than a moral crime. Second, he had violated Nero Wolfe's home to make his point. Both errors had been corrected, with interest compounded daily until the debt was paid in full. The brownstone had returned to its proper silence. Dinner would be served with ingredients of unquestionable provenance, and somewhere in the city, honest food critics could sleep peacefully, knowing that their integrity was worth defending. It was, I thought as I helped myself to Fritz's perfectly seasoned soup, a satisfying conclusion to a case that had begun with a spoon and ended with justice properly served. The morning after justice has been served carries its own particular satisfaction, the quiet contentment of a problem solved and principles vindicated. I arrived at the office at 8:30 to find Wolfe already settled behind his desk with the morning paper spread before him and an expression that suggested Fritz had outdone himself with breakfast. The contaminated saffron jar had vanished from the safe, presumably consigned to whatever fate awaits ingredients that have betrayed their essential nature. The demonstration of method. The Times gives Mr. Marsh's exposé the full front page, Wolfe observed without looking up. Metropolitan Food Services raided by federal agents, Leon Kastner in custody, 12 restaurants temporarily closed pending investigation. Inspector Kramer is quoted extensively and appears to have enjoyed himself. Before I could respond, Fritz appeared in the doorway bearing a silver tray with 3 small glass cups of warm milk and 2 saucers containing neat piles of crimson threads. His face held the grim satisfaction of a man about to demonstrate the difference between authenticity and fraud. "Inspector Kramer wishes to understand the methodology," Wolfe said, gesturing toward the red leather chair where the inspector was settling his bulk. "A jury will want it explained. So will the public. They will not be content with invoices and confessions. They will ask how a respected critic was made a fool before 200 witnesses without a single other palate to corroborate his experience." Fritz set 1 saucer beside the left cup, another beside the right. Wolfe nodded, and Fritz pinched threads from the left saucer into the left cup. The milk accepted them gracefully, and color bled out in delicate filaments, releasing an aroma of honeyed hay with that faint, metallic ghost that genuine saffron carries without ever tasting like a coin. Then Fritz repeated the process with the right cup. The color leaped to flat yellow almost instantly, and the smell hit us like a bad joke. Bright, eager, and fundamentally wrong. "Real," Wolfe said, indicating the left. "Counterfeit," indicating the right. The latter yields its color because dyes have been added for that purpose. But taste alone can be finessed, masked, corrupted in ways that cheat even educated palates. He gestured to the 3rd cup. Fritz lifted a small dropper bottle. "A quaternary bittering compound," Wolfe explained. "A denaturant used to discourage ingestion of industrial products. 1 drop renders any sauce unpalatable to anyone possessing functional taste buds." Fritz added the single drop, and even knowing what to expect, we all flinched slightly. Not because we could smell it, it didn't announce itself that way, but because we understood what it represented. "At the plaza," Wolfe continued, "the beurre blanc was prepared correctly. The contamination was introduced at plating to 1 plate only, the plate designated for Mr. Marsh. The servers were then instructed to clear all plates immediately, regardless of consumption, to prevent comparison. That instruction came not from the kitchen, but from the floor. The unraveling of conspiracy. Kramer scratched notes with the intensity of a man sawing through hardwood. "You can prove the service instructions?" Miss Sand telephoned the banquet manager at 6:31, suggesting service should be crisp and television ready. She followed with a text to the floor captain stating that Mr. Marsh's comments would benefit from immediate turnover. Mr. Panzer obtained both the manager's statement and copies of the messages. I picked up the relevant file. Also, a porter named Rizzo, on Metropolitan's preferred contractor list, carried the saucier from hotline to pass. Security footage shows him stepping into the service corridor for exactly 8 seconds during transit. The contamination happened there. "The humiliation accomplished," Wolfe said. "The abduction followed standard intimidation protocols. Mr. Marsh was approached by a man in plaza staff jacket carrying a clipboard with his name on, official letterhead. He was told there was a problem with his car that required his attention in the garage. Respectability and authority, the twin weapons of successful deception. Julian, who had arrived during the demonstration, straightened in his chair. I wanted to avoid a scene. When the elevator opened on the wrong level and I saw 2 men instead of a garage attendant, it was too late for dignity. As to my kitchen, Wolfe continued, and the temperature seemed to drop. They exploited Fritz's conscientiousness. A hamper arrives with Metropolitan's compliments. The delivery man proves insistent. Fritz, being methodical, sets it aside and goes to verify his inventory. In those 90 seconds, an associate, posted in the alley since noon, enters through the service door, substitutes the saffron, and departs. He takes a pen from Mr. Goodwin's desk as proof of access. The consequences of corruption. The phone rang, and I answered to find Inspector Kramer's voice crackling with satisfaction. Kastner's plea agreement is finalized, Wolfe. 20 years federal prison, full restitution, forfeiture of all assets. His co-conspirators get lighter sentences for testimony, but they'll all serve time. And the restaurants? Civil penalties, mostly. Lost licenses for the worst offenders, heavy fines for the others. The honest establishments get compensation from the forfeiture fund. After Kramer left with his evidence and his prisoners, the office felt strangely peaceful. Julian remained, looking considerably more like himself now that immediate death was no longer a professional hazard. "Mr. Wolfe," he said quietly, "there's one detail that might interest you. The missing spoon from my office collection. I took it to the plaza as a backup. When I fled the table, I forgot it was in my pocket. Later, I used it to sample residue from my primary spoon, confirming the contamination was specific to the dish, not a general problem with my palate. Where is it now? In my office safe, along with samples of all the counterfeit ingredients I collected. Insurance against anyone claiming this was all a misunderstanding. The sacred nature of food. After Julian and Vivian left, Wolfe leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man whose world had been properly restored. The corruption of food is particularly insidious, Archie, because it exploits trust fundamental to survival. When we eat, we must believe that what we consume is what it claims to be. Mr. Kastner violated that trust on an industrial scale, and made millions doing it. Indeed. But wealth obtained through the corruption of sustenance is especially contemptible. It attacks not merely economic interests, but the basic relationship between producer and consumer, between chef and diner, between host and guest. Fritz appeared in the doorway, his round face beaming with quiet triumph. "The kitchen is purified, Mr. Wolfe. The contamination is eliminated. I've also installed new locks and arranged for security consultation. No one will violate my domain again." The return to order. The afternoon passed with the deliberate peace of a problem solved and justice properly served. Fritz hummed in his kitchen, preparing dinner with ingredients of unquestionable provenance. The brownstone had returned to its proper rhythm. Mail sorted, correspondence answered, the world held at appropriate distance until dinner was ready, and principles had been vindicated. At 4 o'clock, Wolfe descended from the plant rooms with the satisfied expression of a man whose orchids were thriving and whose kitchen was inviolate. He settled into his chair and spoke without looking up from his seed catalogue. "When you prepare the final report, Archie, emphasize the systematic nature of the fraud and the courage required to expose it. Mr. Marsh risked career and life to maintain journalistic integrity. Such dedication deserves recognition. And our fee has been earned through the restoration of trust in this city's food supply and the vindication of honest criticism over corrupt commerce." From the kitchen came the sound of Fritz humming as he prepared what promised to be an exceptional dinner, using saffron that had never seen the inside of a counterfeit operation and olive oil that could trace its lineage to specific trees in Tuscan hills. It was, I reflected as I began typing the final report, a satisfying conclusion to a case that had begun with a critic fleeing the table and ended with justice properly served. The brownstone had returned to its sacred silence. Honest food critics could sleep peacefully, and somewhere in federal prison, Leon Kastner was learning that there are some appetites, including the appetite for justice, that cannot be satisfied with substitutes. The spoon had spoken, the truth had been served, and Nero Wolfe's kitchen remained inviolate. In a world full of counterfeit saffron and corrupted critics, that counted as a victory worth savoring. The brownstone on West 35th Street had that particular quality of satisfied silence that comes after principles have been vindicated and order restored. 3 days had passed since Leon Kastner's arrest, and the morning routine had resumed its sacred rhythm with the contentment of an organism that has successfully expelled a toxin. Fritz hummed in his kitchen, preparing breakfast with saffron whose authenticity could be traced to specific fields in Kashmir. The contaminated jar had been consigned to whatever fate awaits ingredients that have betrayed their essential nature, and the world was once again permitted to intrude, but only after coffee had been properly brewed and eggs properly prepared. I was at my desk, sorting through what had become a small avalanche of correspondence, when Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at precisely 9 o'clock. He settled into his chair with the deliberate satisfaction of a man whose orchids were thriving and whose kitchen was inviolate, then glanced at the stack of envelopes with the expression he usually reserved for tax assessments. Fame, I observed, holding up invitations from the James Beard Foundation, the Food and Wine Writers Association, and something called the International Guild of Food Critics, appears to be the inevitable consequence of virtue rewarded. They want to give you awards, speaking fees, and testimonial dinners. Notoriety is the price one pays for doing what should require no special recognition, Wolfe replied, not looking up from his morning paper. Mr. Marsh exposed fraud because that is what honest journalists do. We recovered him because that is what competent investigators do. Neither activity merits ceremonial celebration. The phone had been ringing steadily since 8 o'clock. Television producers, documentary filmmakers, magazine editors, all wanting to tell the story of the food critic who couldn't be silenced and the detective who saved him without leaving his office. I'd been deflecting them with my usual charm, but the requests kept multiplying like mushrooms after rain. Before I could point out that ceremonial celebrations often came with ceremonial fees. Fritz appeared in the doorway bearing a silver tray with coffee and an expression of quiet triumph. The Times food section, he announced, has published an article about the importance of authentic ingredients. They quote Mr. Wolfe extensively on the relationship between honest food and civilized society. His round face beamed with the satisfaction of a man whose professional integrity had been publicly vindicated. 3 suppliers have telephoned, offering ingredients with complete documentation of origin and purity. They say they wish to serve a kitchen that values integrity above convenience. The wider implications. Julian Marsh arrived at 11:30, looking like a man who had been pulled back from the edge of professional destruction and found himself standing on solid ground. His color had returned, his posture had straightened, and his eyes held the focused intensity of a journalist who had discovered that his profession still contained the possibility of genuine consequence. "The story has taken on a life of its own," he reported, settling into the red leather chair. "The FDA has announced new inspection protocols. Congress is discussing legislation requiring origin labeling for luxury ingredients. And personally, I've received 3 book offers, 2 television deals, and a syndication contract that would make my column available in 47 cities." "Apparently," I observed, "nearly being killed for your journalistic integrity is excellent for one's career prospects." Vivian Marsh, who had accompanied her husband, smiled with the relief of a woman who had watched her partner's professional resurrection. Julian has also received letters from food critics around the country, thanking him for proving that honest criticism still matters. It seems the problem was more widespread than anyone realized. "Indeed," Wolfe murmured. "Corruption, like excellence, tends to be systematic rather than isolated. Mr. Kastner's operation was merely the largest and most sophisticated of several such enterprises." Inspector Kramer arrived shortly after noon, carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of a man bearing news that was simultaneously satisfying and problematic. "The district attorney wants to give you both commendations," he announced. "Public ceremony, press coverage. the whole show. Says it's good for police-civilian cooperation and public confidence in the justice system. Wolfe's expression shifted to something approaching horror. Inspector, I solved a case of kidnapping and fraud. I did not volunteer for public exhibition. Yeah, well, tell that to the mayor's office. They're calling it the biggest food safety victory in the city's history. Restaurant reservations are up 20% because people trust the food again. The return to sacred routine. After the various visitors departed to resume their restored lives, the brownstone exhaled and settled back into its proper rhythm. Fritz returned to his kitchen with renewed purpose, preparing lunch with ingredients whose lineage could be traced to specific farms. The afternoon mail brought more interview requests, which I deflected with increasing creativity. The grey sedan and white panel van had vanished as if they'd never existed, replaced by the mundane traffic of honest commerce. A package arrived by messenger, delivered with the slightly bewildered expression of someone who wasn't quite sure what he was carrying. Inside, nestled in silk, was a silver tasting spoon identical to those in Julian's collection, but this one gleamed with fresh polish. The attached card read, "To the only man whose palate truly understands the difference. With deepest gratitude." J.M. Wolfe examined the spoon with the attention he usually reserved for rare orchid specimens, his thumb tracing the smooth curve of the bowl. It was a gesture of acceptance, a silent acknowledgement of a battle fought and won. The spoon, which had been the catalyst for so much turmoil, was now a symbol of restored integrity. Evening reflections. Dinner that evening was Fritz's quiet masterpiece. Roasted guinea fowl with wild mushroom ragout, followed by a delicate apple tart. He had used, I suspected, a careful pinch of the new, verified Kashmiri saffron in the ragout, a subtle celebration of victory over its fraudulent counterpart. Each bite was a testament to genuine flavor, a silent rebuke to the ersatz concoctions of Leon Kastner's empire. After dinner, Wolfe settled into his chair with the contentment of a man whose world had been properly restored. I took my usual seat across from him, and the office filled with the comfortable silence of a case concluded and principles vindicated. Finally, Wolfe broke the quiet, his voice carrying the weight of considered judgment. The corruption of food is not merely an economic crime, Archie. It represents an attack on one of the fundamental relationships that define civilized society, the trust between those who prepare sustenance and those who consume it. He picked up Julian's gift spoon, turning it in the lamplight. Mr. Kastner believed he could deceive the palate, that most discerning of senses. He failed to comprehend that true quality is not merely aesthetic. It is an ethical imperative. The human appetite craves not just sustenance, but authenticity, truth. To corrupt the very food that nourishes us is to corrupt a fundamental aspect of human existence. So it was more than just kidnapping and fraud for you, I said. It was an assault on civilization itself. The kitchen, the dining table, the shared meal, these are the bedrock of human society. When Mr. Kastner violated my kitchen, he committed an act of barbarism that demanded personal response. His eyes held the satisfaction of justice properly served. He discovered that there are some appetites, including the appetite for justice, that cannot be satisfied with substitutes. Wolfe set the spoon on his desk with deliberate care. The brownstone is a sanctuary for such principles, Archie. Its walls protect not merely my orchids, but the standards by which civilized men live. When those standards are threatened, action is required. I rose from my chair, noting how the lamplight caught the silver of Julian's gift, transforming it from mere utensil to symbol. Just another day at the office, saving the world from bad saffron and worse intentions. Wolfe merely grunted, already lost in contemplation of his evening's botanical reading. But I knew, as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, that he was satisfied. The brownstone had returned to its sacred silence, dinner had been served with ingredients of unquestionable integrity, and somewhere in the city, honest food critics were writing honest reviews for trusting readers. In a world full of counterfeit saffron and corrupted commerce, that counted as a victory worth savoring. The spoon had spoken, the truth had been served, and Nero Wolfe's kitchen remained inviolate. A small but significant triumph of authenticity over deception, of principle over profit, of civilization over chaos. Some victories, after all, are best measured not in fees collected, but in trust restored and standards maintained. The case of the food critic who fled the table was closed, but its lessons would resonate through every honest kitchen and every truthful review for years to come.